Hi, good afternoon to you all, and welcome back to the briefing room. We're delighted to welcome for the first time in this capacity as chairperson of the African Union Commission, Mahamoud Ali Youssouf, and of course we have the Secretary General. They just wrapped up the annual African Union UN conference. They'll both make some statements and then we'll take some questions. Mr. Chairperson, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. We held this afternoon the 9th high-level dialogue between the United Nations and the African Union. And these discussions have been going on for the past couple of days. It is indeed a strategic platform for a periodic consultation and coordination between our two organizations. The African Union and the United Nations have aligned their development agendas, Agenda 2063 and Agenda 2030. And our two organizations are also working closely on flagship programs of peace, and in particular, the African flagship program on peace called Silencing the Guns on the African continent by 2030. The African Union and the United Nations had deployed together tremendous efforts for the adoption of the Pact of the Future. And now our two organizations are very much involved in advancing the cause of climate justice and energy transition. And the African Union is also committed to work with all parties and stakeholders at the United Nations to achieve a transparent, equitable, and just reform of the UN Security Council. These reforms are indeed of paramount importance and would ultimately consolidate the multilateral system. Besides, our two organizations are faced with financial strains. We need to adapt our actions and programs to the new realities. In the same vein, it is critical to continue to support peace operations, the fight against terrorism, conflict prevention and resolution, and also focus most of our efforts on humanitarian affairs. These are priority sectors that should not and cannot suffer from lack of financial resources. Besides, peace and security on our continent, the African continent in particular, and the world at large are closely interconnected. That's why the African Union believes that Resolution 2719 remains the most predictable and sustainable source of financing for peace operations on the continent. Yes, we do have a lot of challenges in Somalia. Sudan is in great chaos, big chaos. Eastern DRC are very fragile. The Sahel also has to be, the situation in the Sahel has to be followed closely. But we also have put forward, rolled out a number of strategies, action plans to handle and tackle those crises. But we cannot do it alone. We need the support of the United Nations. And I know that the United Nations, under the leadership of the Secretary General, is standing by the African continent. Our partnership and collaboration with the Secretary General and his team are essential for our union in order to silence the guns in those countries and regions. So once again, I just wanted to thank His Excellency, the Secretary General, for his dedication and commitment for peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, Secretary General.
Ladies and gentlemen of the media, let me begin by welcoming Chairperson Mahamoud Ali Youssouf and thanking him for today's very fruitful discussion. This was our first annual meeting with the African Union Commission since he took up his post, and one that builds on earlier momentum. Cooperation between our organizations has never been stronger or more necessary. Our world is in turmoil, rocked by deadly conflicts, widening inequalities, climate chaos, and runaway technologies. And the impacts are felt deeply on the African continent. I wish to address three areas where decisive action is needed. First, making Africa a priority. Since the start of my first mandate, I have taken steps to keep Africa high on the UN agenda. A closer strategic alliance with the AU was at the center of this work, building on shared values, mutual respect, common interests, and complementarity. This led to our joint framework on peace and security, improving collaboration from early conflict indicators to post-conflict peace building. Our joint framework on sustainable development, accelerating the shared ambitions of the AU's Agenda 2063 and the UN's 2030 Agenda. And our joint frameworks on human rights, which enhance protection and strengthen inclusive democratic institutions and the rule of law. More recently, the Pact for the Future reaffirmed the importance of collaborating with regional organizations, and specifically the AU, and of addressing African needs and aspirations on peace and security, on sustainable development, on human use and future generations, on science, technology, and innovation, and more. And the Pact also called for permanent seats for Africa on the Security Council, correcting once and for all an intolerable injustice faced by the African continent. Our engagement with the EU likewise informs UN80 initiative, which aims to realign our work in ways that improve support to the most vulnerable countries in Africa and beyond. But we cannot deliver for Africa without adequate, predictable, and sustained resources. I call on member states to pay their regular assessments and peacekeeping contributions in full and on time. Second, financing for development and innovation. Africa's history is as old as humanity. Its resources are vast and have driven the growth of many economies. Its people are the future. But its progress is held back by an outdated and unfair global financial system. The time has come to reform this financial architecture so it reflects the world of today and better serves the needs of developing countries, particularly in Africa. It must become more inclusive, representative, equitable, and effective. And this means giving developing countries more meaningful participation in global financial institutions, and tripling the lending capacity of multilateral development banks, and easing debt burdens with new instruments to reduce the cost of capital, to lower borrowing costs, to extend maturity, align debt services to ability to pay, and speed up sovereign debt resolution for countries facing debt distress. African leadership helped secure the Seville commitment, which takes concrete steps to advance work on these issues. And later this month, I will take this message to the G20 summit in Johannesburg, urging G20 members to lead on these long overdue reforms, and welcome the Africa-Europe Foundation's work on resetting and strengthening the relations between the two continents. Africa also needs investment to ensure it benefits from the clean energy revolution. Solar and wind are now the cheapest sources of power and the fastest growing sources of electricity in history. No continent has more sunshine or wind than Africa, but it lacks the funds to invest in renewables at the speed and scale required. Too many African countries are starved of the resources to adapt and locked out of the clean energy transition, while investments in Africa for clean energy flow to developed countries. In a few days, I will return to COP30 in Belém and reiterate a message that could not be more clear. Developed countries have a moral imperative to act by closing the climate ambition gap to keep the 1.5 degrees limit within reach, doubling adaptation finance to at least $40 billion this year, and massively scaling up adaptation finance in the years to come. And adaptation is absolutely crucial for the African continent that practically does not contribute to climate change, but it is in the front line of the most negative impacts of climate change. On the other hand, developed countries must provide at least $300 billion a year for mitigation and adaptation, and helping to mobilize $1.3 trillion annually by 2025 to meet the needs of developing countries. And delivering a climate justice package that brings equity, dignity, and opportunity to communities that, like many in Africa, are on the front lines of the climate crisis. Third, investing in peace. Sustainable development and peace are interdependent and mutually reinforcing. In this respect, I wish to reaffirm my full support for the EU Silence the Guns initiatives. Its vision is compelling an integrated, prosperous and peaceful Africa. Its ambition is bold, to end all wars and violent conflicts on the continent. And its approach is smart, aligning efforts across the humanitarian, development and peace sectors. And its time is now. Today, Africa is home to too many conflicts and too much suffering. In Sudan, I'm gravely concerned by recent reports of mass atrocities and gross human rights violations in El Fasher and worsening violence in the Kordofans. The flow of weapons and fighters from external parties must be cut off. The flow of humanitarian aid must be able to quickly reach civilians in need. The hostilities must stop, and I call on the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces to engage with my personal envoy for Sudan, Ramtan Lamamra, and take swift, tangible steps towards a negotiated settlement. I'm also deeply alarmed by rising insecurity in the Sahel, as armed groups and terrorist networks exploit fragile governance and intercommunal tensions. The developments in Mali, including the full blockade, make a dire situation even worse, posing new risks to the wider region and the entire continent. Trust must be urgently restored, and cooperation between countries across the region must be re-established. In South Sudan, delays in implementing the peace agreement cloud prospects for credible and peaceful elections in December 2026. Its leaders must urgently summon the political will to make difficult compromises and prevent a return to conflict. In Somalia, chronic underfunding of the African Union Support and Stabilization Mission narrows the path from conflict to recovery. Security Council Resolution 2719 established a framework for predictable financing of EU-led operations, authorized by the Council through assessed contributions. Regrettably, the Council has yet to agree on how to materialize these commitments, and this has real consequences for AUSOM, which remains indispensable for Somalia's security transition and counter-terrorism efforts. International partners must urgently close the 2025 funding gap and ensure predictable support for the remainder of the mission. In Libya, dialogue and compromise are essential to overcome political and institutional divisions. The AU-UN Annual Conference expressed its full support for the UN roadmap to enable national elections and then the transitional phase, and for the Libyan National Peace and Reconciliation Charter. Mesdames et Messieurs,
Ladies and gentlemen, in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo, decades of conflict have caused a tragic humanitarian crisis with 5.7 million displaced persons and 21 million people needing vital assistance. Public services have collapsed, cholera is raging, and the donors need to rally by providing real responses to the humanitarian crisis that is sorely underfunded. The combatants must immediately stop their hostilities in order to enable the swift implementation of the peace agreement. All parties must honor their commitments to the Washington Peace Agreement and the Declaration of Principles of Doha, and fully uphold Resolution 2773 of the Security Council. The root causes of instability and violence in the east of the country must be rooted out. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the press, the world should not turn its back on Africa. It has a large proportion of humanity in it. The stakes are too high and the potential is absolutely enormous. I would once again like to thank President Youssouf, and I'm delighted that our cooperation is still further strengthening. Thank you very much indeed.